The 8th of May, 1945, marked the final death rattle of Adolf Hitler's thousand-year Reich, though for Helga Brenner and thousands of other Wehrmachthelferinnen scattered across the crumbling German landscape, the end had already arrived weeks earlier in the form of American tanks rolling through their positions. The Young Communications Auxiliary had spent 3 years operating listening equipment for the Luftwaffe, watching the skies for Allied bombers that came with increasing regularity to turn German cities into infernos of ash and rubble. Now she stood in a processing line somewhere in the American occupation zone, her gray uniform torn and filthy, waiting to discover what fate the victors had in store for her. The story of German women prisoners in American hands remains one of the lesser-known chapters of the Second World War, overshadowed by the larger narrative of the 425,000 male German prisoners who flooded into camps across the United States. Yet by the war's end, approximately 500,000 women had served as Wehrmachtshilfen, and when the Third Reich collapsed, many found themselves swept up in the massive Allied prisoner collections alongside their male counterparts. Their experiences would challenge everything they had been told about their American enemies. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric, degenerate mongrels incapable of civilized warfare. The regime's newspapers had published lurid accounts of atrocities committed against German soldiers and civilians, warning that capture meant torture, starvation, and death. Young German women serving the Wehrmacht had absorbed these messages through years of indoctrination, first in the Bund Deutscher Mächte, the League of German Girls, and later through military orientation sessions that emphasized the supposed bestial nature of their enemies. Helga had joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries in 1942, answering the Nazi Party's call for young women to replace men in communications and clerical positions so that those men could be sent to the increasingly desperate fronts. She was 21 years old, unmarried, and like many of her generation, a product of Nazi education that had shaped her worldview since childhood. The Blitzmädchen, as the female auxiliaries were sometimes called, often faced harsh criticism from German society, even as they performed essential military functions. They were accused of moral laxity and improper behavior, called officers' mattresses, by civilians who viewed their service with suspicion. The Wehrmacht High Command had maintained a peculiar attitude toward its female auxiliaries. These women were subject to military law and discipline, yet they were not officially considered soldiers. They wore uniforms, took orders, served alongside men in dangerous positions near the front lines, but the ideology of the Reich could not acknowledge them as warriors. Women were meant to be mothers and homemakers, not participants in combat operations. This ambiguity would prove significant when the Allied forces began processing captured German personnel and had to determine who qualified as a prisoner of war. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the military situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. Units that had been operating communication stations, anti-aircraft positions, and administrative offices suddenly found themselves in the path of advancing enemy forces. Some women managed to shed their uniforms and disappear into the civilian population. Others were captured while still performing their duties, their positions overrun before they could evacuate. Still, others surrendered voluntarily, having witnessed the chaos of the final German collapse and recognizing that continued resistance was pointless. The processing of these captured women presented American commanders with unexpected challenges. According to the research documented by Oxford Academics' examination of women prisoners of war, the Western Allies had minimal experience handling female military personnel from enemy nations. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners, had been drafted primarily with male combatants in mind. While it specified that women prisoners must be treated with all regard due to their sex, the practical implementation of this requirement in the chaos of Germany's collapse required improvisation and adaptation. The women who passed through American processing stations experienced a range of treatment depending on where they were captured and which units handled them. Some were briefly detained and released almost immediately, particularly young women and those with no apparent Nazi Party affiliations. Others were held for extended periods while military intelligence officers attempted to determine their roles and responsibilities. The most significant figures, particularly women who had served in concentration camps or held positions of authority, faced extensive interrogation and eventual prosecution. For the average Wehrmachtshelfer, however, the primary experience was one of profound disorientation. Everything they had been taught about their captors was being contradicted by the reality unfolding before their eyes. The Americans they encountered were not the savage brutes of Nazi propaganda. They were young men, often barely older than the women they were processing, who followed procedures, maintained discipline, and in many cases demonstrated unexpected courtesy toward their prisoners. This cognitive dissonance would only intensify as some of these women were transported to more permanent facilities. The summer of 1945 brought unprecedented logistical challenges as the Allied forces attempted to manage millions of displaced persons, refugees, and prisoners scattered across the ruins of the Third Reich among the various populations. Requiring attention were German military personnel who had been deemed suitable for extended detention, either for labor purposes or for more thorough processing away from the unstable European continent. While the vast majority of German prisoners transported to the United States were male soldiers captured during combat operations, a small number of women also made the journey across the Atlantic under circumstances that remain poorly documented in official records. The Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps established by the American Army to hold captured German soldiers, had become notorious for their harsh conditions. These temporary enclosures held between 1 and nearly 2 million surrendered Wehrmacht personnel in the months following Germany's capitulation. Prisoners designated as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war were housed in open fields surrounded by barbed wire, with no shelter beyond what they could dig in the earth. Food and water supplies were inadequate, particularly in the early weeks, and though conditions improved over time, the experience left lasting memories among those who passed through these camps. According to the historical documentation provided by Wikipedia's examination of the Rheinwiesenlager, female personnel from the Wehrmacht were among the first groups released from these temporary camps. The Allied commanders recognized that holding women in conditions designed for male combat troops presented both practical and public relations difficulties. Most Wehrmachtshelferinnen were released within weeks of their capture, provided they could demonstrate no affiliation with the Nazi Party or involvement in war crimes. However, some women remained in custody for extended periods, either because they held positions of significance or because the administrative chaos of the occupation prevented their cases from receiving prompt attention. The journey to America for those prisoners who made the crossing was itself a transformative experience. German prisoners were typically transported on Liberty ships returning to the United States after delivering troops and supplies to Europe. These vessels, which would otherwise return empty, could carry thousands of prisoners at a time. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks, during which the prisoners found themselves in circumstances utterly unlike anything they had experienced during years of total war. Food was perhaps the most immediate and striking difference. Germany had implemented strict rationing since the war's earliest days, and by 1945, the civilian population was experiencing severe shortages of everything from bread to soap. The prisoners on American transport ships found themselves receiving meals that seemed impossibly abundant. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee appeared with regularity that prisoners found almost incomprehensible. Men who had subsisted on inadequate rations during the final months of fighting began gaining weight almost immediately upon entering American custody. As documented by the Fold 3 Historical Research Archive, German POW Heino Eriksson described arriving at Fort Leonard would, after a 30-day voyage and finding barracks containing a bed, mattress, blankets, and pillow for each prisoner. "We had the feeling of being in a Hilton hotel," he later recalled. "For years we had been sleeping either inside or on top of our tanks." The prisoners were given food described as a dream meal, and they joked among themselves that had they known they would be treated this way, they would have surrendered earlier instead of fighting until they ran out of ammunition. The comfort of the Pullman train cars that transported prisoners from port facilities to their assigned camps amazed the Germans who had expected cattle, cars, and armed guards beating them with rifle butts. Instead, they found themselves traveling through an American landscape untouched by bombing, where cities remained intact and civilian life continued with apparent normalcy. The sheer size of the United States and its obvious prosperity provided a stark contrast to the devastated Europe they had left behind, and many prisoners found their ideological certainties beginning to crack under the weight of this visible evidence. For the women among these transported prisoners, the experience carried additional layers of meaning. They had been raised in a society that emphasized their role as guardians of German culture and bearers of future generations. The Nazi state had simultaneously restricted their opportunities and glorified their domestic functions. Now they found themselves in a nation that, despite its own limitations and prejudices, represented something fundamentally different from everything they had known. The cognitive dissonance that had begun during initial processing intensified with each mile traveled into the American heartland. The United States had established prisoner of war camps in nearly every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, with the majority located in the South where heating costs were minimal. Over 500 camps eventually housed the German prisoner population, ranging from large base facilities holding thousands of men to small branch camps attached to farms and factories where prisoners provided essential labor. The Geneva Convention's requirements for prisoner treatment meant that American authorities had to provide food, shelter, medical care, and recreational opportunities equivalent to those available to American troops stationed in the same regions. This requirement would produce situations that seemed almost surreal to prisoners who had expected brutal treatment. They found themselves housed in clean barracks, fed regular meals, paid for their labor, and offered opportunities for education and entertainment. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality could not have been more complete, and it began a process of psychological transformation that would influence many prisoners for the rest of their lives. The barracks of Camp Butner in North Carolina represented a world completely alien to everything Marguerite Hoffmann had experienced since joining the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Services in 1943. The 24-year-old former Nachrichten felon, a signals auxiliary who had operated telephone and telegraph equipment for the German army, stood in a processing facility that seemed designed to systematically contradict every expectation she had formed about American captivity. Clean beds awaited her, hot water was available for bathing. Soap, actual soap, sat in dispensers along the washroom walls. And most remarkably, the American personnel processing her were not behaving like the monsters Nazi propaganda had promised. The American treatment of German prisoners has been extensively documented by historians examining this often overlooked aspect of the Second World War, according to the U.S. Army's official historical account published in 2017. When former German prisoner Genter Gerg returned to Joint Base Lewis McChord decades after the war, he spoke only positively about his captivity experience. "All we cared about was the food," he said of prison life, appreciating the meat and vegetables served alongside the opportunity to purchase items unavailable in wartime Germany. It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp considering what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established clear requirements for prisoner treatment that the United States took seriously, in part because American leaders recognized that German treatment of Allied prisoners would likely reflect how Germany perceived American treatment of German prisoners. This calculation proved largely correct. While the German military committed terrible atrocities on the Eastern Front, where both Germans and Soviets murdered prisoners with impunity, Western Allied prisoners in German hands generally received treatment approximating Geneva Convention requirements. The reciprocal relationship encouraged both sides to maintain standards that served their own interests. American camps provided prisoners with food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that received by American soldiers serving in the same facilities. If prisoners had to sleep in tents while their barracks were being constructed, so did their guards. German generals and admirals in custody received individual bungalows with gardens at Camp Clinton and Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The Geneva Convention's mandate of equal treatment meant that prisoners were paid American military wages for their labor, and officers could not be compelled to work at all. For women prisoners, these standards created situations that highlighted the profound differences between American and German approaches to military administration. The clean facilities, the regular meals, the access to bathing and sanitation, the medical care available upon request. All of these elements combined to produce an experience fundamentally at odds with prisoner expectations. Many women had endured severe hardships during the war's final months as Germany's infrastructure collapsed and basic supplies became increasingly scarce. To find themselves in facilities where hot water flowed from taps and clean towels awaited their use seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The camps offered recreational opportunities that further distinguished American captivity from prisoner expectations. Movies were screened regularly. Libraries stocked with books, including many titles banned in Nazi Germany, were available to prisoners who wished to read. Sports facilities allowed prisoners to play soccer and other games. Some camps featured orchestras and theater groups organized by the prisoners themselves. Camp newspapers, edited by prisoner committees, published poetry, stories, and commentary about camp life. According to the historical documentation provided by the National World War II Museum, these opportunities were part of a broader American strategy for managing the prisoner population. Occupied prisoners caused fewer problems than idle ones, and the provision of recreational activities helped maintain order while also exposing German prisoners to American culture and values. The re-education program that operated under the name Special Projects Division used subtle methods to challenge Nazi ideology without explicitly violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition against exposing prisoners to propaganda. The women who experienced American captivity found these conditions, forcing them to reconsider fundamental beliefs about their enemies and about the regime they had served. The simple fact of being treated humanely contradicted years of indoctrination that had painted Americans as civilizational inferiors incapable of decent behavior. The material abundance visible in the camps, from the quality of food to the availability of consumer goods in the canteen, challenged Nazi claims about German cultural and industrial superiority. And the relative freedom of thought permitted within the camps, where prisoners could read banned books and discuss previously forbidden topics, opened intellectual horizons that had been deliberately closed by the Nazi educational system. The psychological impact of these experiences varied among individual prisoners. Some maintained their ideological commitments despite contradictory evidence, attributing good treatment to American weakness or viewing it as a temporary condition that would change once the propaganda value diminished. Others underwent profound transformations, abandoning Nazi beliefs entirely and embracing democratic values with the enthusiasm of converts. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, gradually modifying their worldviews as prolonged exposure to American society wore down the certainties that had sustained them through years of war. Morning roll call at Camp Papago Park in Arizona began at 7 o'clock when prisoners assembled in the compound to be counted by American guards. The camp, which had been called Schlaraffenland, the land of milk and honey, by its predominantly naval prisoner population, represented one of the more comfortable facilities in the American prisoner of war system. Located in the desert outside Phoenix, Camp Papago Park housed over 3,000 German prisoners in conditions that seemed almost leisurely compared to the brutal combat many had experienced before their capture. According to the National Park Service's historical documentation of Arizona's World War II heritage, prisoners at Camp Papago Park were not required to work or study, though many chose to perform labor as a means of combating boredom. The camp featured a theater where films were screened twice weekly and where the camp choir could practice and perform. A camp newspaper, the Papago Run Show, published articles, stories, and announcements for the prisoner community. The relative comfort of the facility would later contribute to one of the war's most famous prisoner escapes, when 25 Germans tunneled out of the camp on December 23, 1944, only to find that the American desert was a far more formidable barrier than the camp's barbed wire fences. Daily routines in American camps followed patterns established by the Geneva Convention and American military regulation. Prisoners who volunteered for work details departed after breakfast to labor in agricultural fields, factories, or other facilities requiring their services. They were paid for this labor, typically 80 cents per day, which they could spend at camp canteens on items ranging from cigarettes to ice cream. The availability of such goods astonished prisoners who had come from a Germany where rationing had made such items unobtainable luxuries. The work performed by German prisoners addressed a critical labor shortage that had developed as American men entered military service. By 1945, over 115,000 prisoners were working in agriculture alone, harvesting crops that might otherwise have rotted in the fields. They worked in canneries, factories, and lumber operations. They maintained roads and constructed buildings. Their labor was valuable enough that politicians in rural states requested additional prisoners to meet agricultural needs, and when repatriation finally began, many American farmers expressed genuine sorrow at losing workers who had become valuable and sometimes personally liked. For women prisoners, work assignments typically reflected gendered assumptions about appropriate female labor. Administrative tasks, clerical work, laundry services, and food preparation represented common assignments. Some women worked in hospitals or medical facilities, utilizing nursing or caretaking skills they had developed during their Wehrmacht service. Others performed agricultural labor alongside male prisoners, particularly during harvest seasons when all available hands were needed in the fields. The camp experience included opportunities for education and self-improvement that many prisoners embraced enthusiastically. American authorities established programs offering instruction in English, American history, and democratic governance. These programs operated under the designation intellectual diversion to avoid accusations that the United States was violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition against exposing prisoners to propaganda. The courses presented information about American society and values without explicitly requiring prisoners to abandon their previous beliefs, though the content was carefully selected to challenge Nazi ideology. Libraries in the camps stocked works by authors whose books had been burned in Nazi Germany. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette were among the most popular titles. German prisoner Kurt Vinz, writing in the intercamp journal Der Ruf, expressed a sentiment shared by many of his fellow prisoners. Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different. Religious services were available to prisoners of various faiths, with Catholic, Protestant, and other denominations holding regular worship. Some prisoners found spiritual renewal in the relative peace of camp life after the chaos and violence of combat. Others used religious gatherings as social opportunities, ways to connect with fellow prisoners and maintain community bonds. Camp chaplains, both American and German, played important roles in prisoner welfare, offering counseling and support to men and women struggling with the psychological aftermath of war and captivity. The psychological dimensions of camp life were complex and varied. Some prisoners experienced captivity as a welcome relief from the constant danger of combat and the hopelessness of Germany's military situation. Others struggled with guilt over their capture, wondering whether they should have fought to the death rather than surrendering. Still others experienced depression and anxiety as they contemplated uncertain futures and worried about family members left behind in a devastated Europe. The extended separation from home, combined with uncertainty about conditions in occupied Germany, created persistent stress that affected prisoners regardless of how well they were treated materially. The film projector in the camp auditorium flickered to life, casting images onto the white screen that would forever change how the assembled prisoners understood the regime they had served. The footage showed emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, MASS graves being excavated by horrified Allied soldiers, survivors so skeletal they seemed barely human. These were the concentration camps, the death factories that had operated across Nazi-controlled Europe, now revealed in their full horror to German prisoners who had claimed ignorance of such atrocities. The mandatory viewing of concentration camp footage represented one of the American military's most direct attempts to confront German prisoners with the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the requirement that prisoners watch these films was implemented across the camp system. The images were devastating and their impact on prisoner psychology was profound. According to the historical research documented by North Carolina's official state encyclopedia, NCPEDIA, after viewing such footage at Camp Butner, 1,000 German prisoners burned their Wehrmacht uniforms voluntarily, physically rejecting their association with the regime that had perpetrated such horrors. For many prisoners, the footage confirmed rumors and suspicions they had harbored but suppressed during their years of service. Germany's military had operated in close proximity to the concentration camp system, and claims of complete ignorance were often more convenient than truthful. Some soldiers had served as guards at camps. Others had transported prisoners or supplies. Still, others had witnessed shootings, mass graves, or other evidence of genocide without fully processing what they had seen. The forced confrontation with documentary evidence made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. Former prisoner Gunter Gerg later described his reaction to learning about Nazi atrocities while in American custody. According to the U.S. Army's published account of his testimony, Gerg said that he and other prisoners could not believe it when an American military officer told them about Jews being murdered in concentration camps. The propaganda they had absorbed during years under Nazi rule had prepared them to dismiss Allied claims as fabrications, yet the evidence being presented was too overwhelming to ignore. The psychological impact of these revelations varied among prisoners. Some experienced genuine shock and horror, their understanding of their service transformed by the knowledge of what the Nazi regime had truly been doing. Others reacted with denial, insisting that the footage must be faked or exaggerated, unable to accept that they had served a government capable of such systematic evil. Still, others acknowledged the facts while seeking to distance themselves personally, arguing that ordinary soldiers had known nothing and bore no responsibility for the actions of the SS and Nazi leadership. Women prisoners faced particular psychological challenges in processing this information. Many had served the Wehrmacht out of genuine patriotism, believing they were supporting their nation's legitimate defense against foreign enemies. The revelation that this service had enabled a genocidal regime forced painful reconsiderations of personal choices and moral responsibility. The Blitzmädchen had been told they were serving Germany, protecting their families and communities. Learning that their service had contributed to the operation of death camps created lasting trauma for many. The re-education programs operating in American camps intensified after VA Day, with the Special Projects Division implementing accelerated courses on democratic governance for selected prisoners. These programs, documented extensively by historians examining the American approach to prisoner education, aimed to create a cadre of Germans who could contribute to the reconstruction of their country along democratic lines. 25,000 graduates of these intensive programs were returned directly to Germany rather than being used for additional labor in Europe, the beginning of an American effort to reshape German society from within. The effectiveness of these re-education efforts has been debated by historians. Many in the office of the Provost Marshal General opposed the program, believing that changing adults' fundamental philosophies was impossible and potentially dangerous. Surveys conducted at the end of the war suggested that the majority of prisoners had not significantly altered their views as a result of the formal re-education curriculum. However, other factors may have been more influential than classroom instruction. The lived experience of American treatment, the material evidence of American prosperity, and the devastating revelations about Nazi crimes all contributed to shifting prisoner attitudes in ways that formal programs could not have achieved alone. For women prisoners, the combination of confronting Nazi atrocities while experiencing unexpectedly humane treatment created a powerful juxtaposition that influenced their understanding of both their former government and their current captors. The regime that had promised them glory and security had perpetrated unspeakable horrors. The enemy that propaganda had painted as savage and inhuman was providing them with food, shelter, and basic human dignity. This contradiction forced reconsiderations that formal education programs could only supplement, not replace. The Red Cross postal card trembled slightly in Anna Schultz's hands as she composed the carefully censored words that would travel across the Atlantic to reach her mother in what remained of Hamburg. The 26-year-old former Stabshelferin, a staff auxiliary who had worked in Wehrmacht administrative offices, had been in American custody for nearly 4 months, and this would be her first communication with family since her capture. The card offered only limited space for her message, but the simple act of making contact represented an emotional lifeline to a world that had vanished in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established specific requirements for prisoner correspondence, recognizing that communication with families served essential humanitarian purposes. Article 36 specified that prisoners must be enabled to write postal cards informing their families of capture and health status within 1 week of arrival at a camp. Regular correspondence was also protected, though wartime conditions and the need for censorship created practical limitations on what could be transmitted and how quickly messages could travel. For prisoners separated from their families by thousands of miles and the ruins of a world war, these communications took on enormous significance. Rumors circulated constantly through the camps about conditions in occupied Germany, about Allied bombing damage, about Soviet occupation of eastern territories, about the fate of specific cities and regions. Prisoners whose families lived in areas now under Soviet control faced particularly acute anxiety, aware that conditions under Russian occupation were reported to be far harsher than those in the American, British, or French zones. The censorship process meant that letters could not contain detailed information about camp locations, conditions, or American military operations. Prisoners learned to communicate essential information through careful phrasing that satisfied censors while conveying meaning to intended recipients. They wrote about their health, their activities, their hopes for the future, carefully avoiding anything that might result in their messages being confiscated or delayed. Receiving letters from Germany provided prisoners with desperately needed information about family members and home communities. Many discovered that homes had been destroyed in bombing raids, that relatives had died during the war's final months, that the Germany they remembered had been fundamentally transformed by occupation and partition. Some learned of family members who had disappeared, their fates unknown, possibly dead or possibly surviving somewhere in the chaotic landscape of post-war Europe. Each letter brought both comfort and potential heartbreak. For women prisoners, separation from families carried particular emotional weight given the gender expectations of their culture. Many had left behind parents, siblings, and in some cases children when they entered Wehrmacht service. The extended captivity meant years away from family obligations and relationships that German society emphasized as women's primary responsibilities. Some women received letters informing them that family members had assumed care of their children or that household arrangements had been reorganized in their absence, news that brought relief about immediate concerns while raising questions about their futures. Camp libraries received German-language newspapers that provided prisoners with information about conditions in their homeland. These publications, selected by American authorities for their content, presented pictures of a Germany in ruins, struggling to rebuild under Allied occupation. The contrast between the prosperity visible in America and the devastation described in reports from home reinforced messages about the consequences of Nazi governance without requiring explicit propaganda. Some prisoners received visits from Relief Society representatives who could carry verbal messages and provide additional information about conditions in Germany. These visits offered opportunities for more detailed communication than written correspondence allowed, though they were relatively rare and typically reserved for special circumstances. Religious organizations played particularly important roles in facilitating communication and providing emotional support to prisoners struggling with the uncertainties of their situations. The emotional strain of extended captivity, combined with anxiety about families and uncertainty about the future, affected prisoners in various ways. Some maintained psychological stability through work, education, and social connections within the camp community. Others experienced depression, anxiety, or other psychological difficulties that required intervention by camp medical staff. The American military provided mental health services to prisoners who needed them, recognizing that psychological welfare contributed to camp order and reflected the humanitarian standards the United States claimed to uphold.